This is a true story. It isn't dramatic, but it changed everything for the people involved. On the night of November 13th, 1974, in the quiet town of Amityville, New York, the sky was clear and still. The streets were lined with houses that looked almost identical: white siding, trimmed lawns, little porch lights that glowed faintly in the dark. At 112 Ocean Avenue, nothing seemed out of place from the outside. No broken windows, no raised voices, no signs of panic. Inside the home lived the DeFeo family: Ronald "Big Ronnie" DeFeo Sr., his wife Louise, and their 5 children: Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr., 23, Dawn, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John Matthew, 9. The official records later showed that sometime in the early morning hours, likely between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., each of them was shot while asleep in their beds with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that anyone tried to escape. No neighbors reported hearing screaming. Many didn't even report hearing gunshots. That silence became one of the first disturbing details. At 6:30 p.m. that day, Ronald DeFeo Jr. ran into a local bar called Henry's Bar, shouting that his parents had been shot. Several men followed him back to the house. Police were called, and when officers entered the home, they moved slowly from bedroom to bedroom, finding each member of the family lying face down. The bed sheets still pulled up, as if none of them had ever woken. The official time of death, the names, the autopsy findings, all of it is preserved in court records, police reports, and news articles from that week. These aren't urban legends, they're documented facts. That same night, DeFeo Jr. was taken into custody. At first, he said the killings were carried out by a mob hitman. The next day, confronted with inconsistencies, he confessed. He said the voices, the pressure, the anger, all of it had been building. He said he couldn't control it anymore. In November 1975, he was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life for each count. That was the crime: clear, traceable, evidence-based. But the house didn't empty forever. About a year later, in December 1975, a new family moved in. George and Kathleen Lutz, along with Kathleen's 3 children, Daniel, Christopher, and Missy, purchased the property for $80,000. They later stated publicly, in interviews and written accounts, that they knew about the murders before moving in. They thought they could live with the knowledge. They thought the past was the past. Within the first few nights, they said things didn't feel right. Small things at first: temperature changes, sounds they couldn't place, objects shifting slightly, doors opening on their own. And they claimed the sounds always seemed to happen after midnight. The house didn't scream, it didn't slam, it didn't perform, it whispered. The Lutz family described it as faint, almost like air moving under a door, sometimes like their names being spoken quietly from another room, sometimes like a murmur in the walls. They said they tried to ignore it. They said they tried to explain it away. But the unease didn't leave. Local news archives from 1976 contain interviews where the Lutz family repeated the same accounts, quietly, consistently. No theatrics, just the same simple statements. They also stated that the timeline mattered: midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2:15 a.m. Always late, always after the world outside went silent. Meanwhile, the official records of the DeFeo case remained unchanged. The conviction stood. The causes of death were clear. Witness testimony, police photography, forensic evidence. Everything about the murders themselves was cataloged and preserved. 2 timelines, one factual, one experiential. They overlapped inside the same walls. Neighbors later reported that the house always seemed a little too quiet at night, even before the Lutz family arrived. A few said they sometimes avoided walking past it after dark. Not because they expected anything to happen, but because it felt heavy, weighted, as though the air grew denser near the property line. George Lutz reported that he often woke at 3:15 a.m., the approximate time later associated with the murders. He said he didn't know why. He wasn't jolted awake. He simply opened his eyes and saw the clock. 3:15, night after night. He didn't tell Kathleen at first. She noticed anyway. From December 1975 to January 1976, the Lutz family maintained that the house changed them. They became withdrawn, sleep deprived, quiet. Their friends visited less. Invitations stopped coming. Bills went unpaid. The days blurred together. Still, they tried to stay. They lasted 28 days. On January 14th, 1976, they left the house. They later stated that they didn't even take most of their belongings. They said they couldn't stay another night. The home was left silent again. Everything said about those nights afterward, interviews, legal disputes, media investigations, exists in public record. What can be verified and what can only be reported as testimony are separate. But the original crime remains the unshakable foundation of the story. And even today, one detail comes up again and again in the most careful retellings. The house didn't make noise during the day. People said it waited until the lights were off, until the clocks crossed midnight, until footsteps faded, and then, so quietly it almost didn't matter. It whispered. But that still wasn't the strangest part. When investigators revisited the timeline of November 13th, 1974, they noted something that would continue to unsettle people who later learned about the case. The DeFeo family members were all found lying face down in their beds. No defensive wounds, no signs of sedatives in the toxicology reports, and no neighbors reported hearing the rifle shots clearly, despite the weapon being loud enough that normal expectation would suggest someone nearby might have noticed. These details are preserved in the Suffolk County records and court testimony. They belong to the factual layer of the story, the one with paperwork and signatures. After the murders, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue was processed, photographed, analyzed. It was not treated as a mystery. It was treated as a crime scene. And when Ronald DeFeo Jr. was arrested and later convicted in November 1975, the narrative in the court stayed focused on culpability, mental state, and responsibility, not superstition. The house itself remained still. When the Lutz family moved in on December 18th, 1975, they did something practical first. They had the home blessed. That's a detail they later repeated consistently in interviews, books, and legal testimony. A priest, commonly reported as Father Ralph Pecoraro, was said to have visited the house shortly after the move-in. His account later varied slightly across different retellings, but the most referenced version stated that he heard a voice sharply whisper the words, "Get out." He left shortly afterward. Years later, in legal and media contexts, he confirmed visiting the home and feeling uncomfortable there, though the exact phrasing of what he heard is difficult to verify beyond reported statements. But the constant thread remained. Whatever people said they heard was quiet. From December 19th onward, the Lutz family described their lives becoming increasingly restrained. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't socialize much. Their world narrowed to the inside of the house. Friends who visited reportedly didn't stay long. Some mentioned a heaviness inside. None of that appears in official legal records. Those are recollections spoken later. Still, the same language kept resurfacing across different years, different interviews. Quiet, heavy, strange after midnight. There were also household details that can be traced to documentation. Financial stress, the burden of the mortgage, the already public notoriety of the property. The Lutz family had purchased a house directly associated with a multiple murder case. The psychological weight of that decision is something researchers and journalists later discussed when reviewing the case. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued on. Children walked to school, cars pulled into driveways. Newspapers were delivered in the morning. The house did not draw attention in daylight. But by late December 1975, George reported waking repeatedly around 3:15 a.m. He said it wasn't panic, just awareness. He would look at the clock. The digits would glow back. Sometimes he walked through the house. Sometimes he just lay still and listened. He said the sounds never came before midnight. There were also accounts of temperature changes, cold spots described in multiple statements. These statements are preserved in interviews and recordings dating back to 1976. Some investigators later suggested drafts, insulation issues, or structural causes. Others focused on the psychological toll of living in a home already soaked in tragedy. But the part that stayed with listeners was the pacing, not frantic, measured, as if the house itself adhered to a schedule. The priest's report, the family's claims, the subsequent investigations, they form the second timeline. It is not the legal record, it sits beside the legal record, close enough to brush against it, but separate enough that each must be handled differently. Because the deaths are proven, the whispers are described. By early January 1976, the Lutz family noted behavioral changes within themselves. George became increasingly isolated. Kathleen reported recurring nightmares involving the murders. The children became quiet. Their world revolved around the house. Phone calls dwindled. Mail piled up. Appointments slipped. The days were ordinary. The nights were not. George said he sometimes heard faint movement in the halls. Not footsteps. More like fabric shifting. Breathing that stopped when he held his own breath to listen. He didn't talk loudly about it. Most of the time, he didn't talk about it at all. Outside of their home, the case of Ronald DeFeo Jr. remained a matter of courts, appeals, legal motions, and psychiatric evaluations. Journalists focused on the criminal responsibility, on whether voices played a role in his mental state, but the legal verdict stood. He acted alone. He was guilty. He would remain in prison. Inside the house, the Lutz family's story unfolded along its own quiet track. There were reports of doors opening slightly on their own, windows shifting, a small sound in the walls like a draft, but without wind. These were, again, statements repeated afterward, not officially recorded at the time, but the pattern held. Nothing loud, nothing theatrical. Always after midnight. When paranormal investigators and journalists later became involved, after the Lutz family had already left, they brought their own methods and interpretations. Some came with equipment, some came with notebooks, some came with skepticism. The house received attention not because it screamed, but because people said it whispered, and those whispers seemed tied to time. 12 hours a.m., 1 a.m., 2 hours a.m., 3:15 a.m., never dinner time, never mid-morning, never afternoon. It waited for quiet. People who examined the case later in documentaries and print articles noted the complicated nature of memory, how trauma, stress, and expectation can shape the way people recall events. Others held to the belief that something lingered in the house. The debate stretched on for decades, but underlying every version of the story was the same: unchangeable truth. 6 people died in that house. Their names and ages are written in black ink on official forms. Their photographs exist in archival storage. Their burial places are real. Everything else moves more softly. By the time January 14, 1976 arrived, the Lutz family said they could no longer stay. They left suddenly. They did not return to sleep there again. Their furniture and belongings, at least many of them, remained inside until later arrangements were made. Later owners would live in the property without public incident. The house itself still stands, though its address was eventually changed. Not to erase anything, but perhaps to soften the edges of a story that had grown larger than the structure that contained it. Yet one detail has persisted, not in shouting headlines, but in the quieter interviews, the careful retellings, the moments when someone leans forward just slightly, lowers their voice, and repeats the same observation. The house never raised its voice. It only whispered after midnight, and that's when things grew darker. By the time the Lutz family's account began circulating publicly in 1976, 2 very different narratives were already taking shape. One grounded in court records and investigative files, the other built from interviews, taped statements, and the recollections of the people who had lived inside 112 Ocean Avenue for just 28 days. The legal narrative never changed. The experiential one kept unfolding. In February 1976, after the Lutz family had already left the home, they participated in what became one of the more widely referenced events associated with the case. A reported gathering that included Ed and Lorraine Warren, along with other investigators and media members. Photographs were taken, notes were written, recordings were made. Later media projects referenced these visits repeatedly. To this day, those materials exist in archives, documentaries, and news coverage. Some viewers believe them, others don't. But the dates, the names, and the presence of those involved are traceable. Meanwhile, the original crime, the deaths of the DeFeo family in 1974, continued through appeals courts and legal proceedings. Ronald DeFeo Jr. remained incarcerated. His statements over the years shifted. Sometimes he described different versions of what happened. Sometimes he implicated others before retracting. These inconsistencies are reflected in later interviews and reports. The court's decision, however, remained stable. He was responsible. He would not be released. The house remained a focal point of attention. Former neighbors described reporters arriving, tourists driving slowly past the property, sometimes stopping, sometimes pointing. The quiet neighborhood became a place where strangers showed up without speaking to anyone. Residents later reported that the constant presence of outsiders felt more intrusive than anything that might have allegedly occurred inside the house itself. Yet, even with all the outside noise, the core of the Lutz family's account was defined by its restraint. They didn't describe loud banging or obvious visual phenomena. They didn't describe theatrical scenes. They described something subtler, something tied to environment, something that began late at night, after midnight, when the house was still. A whisper, a murmur, a presence that seemed to hover just beneath the level of normal sound. In interviews recorded in the late 1970s, George Lutz maintained that he frequently woke at 3:15 a.m. He did not claim to see dramatic apparitions. He did not claim to be physically assaulted by an unseen force. Instead, he described the experience as one of awareness. He was simply awake, the same time, the same pattern, night after night. That repetition is what disturbed listeners, because repetition creates expectation, and expectation creates dread. Researchers in criminal psychology and trauma later pointed out that people living under sustained stress, financial strain, social scrutiny, unresolved grief about living in a home tied to multiple homicides, can experience sleep disruption, hypervigilance, and intrusive thoughts. Those possibilities coexist with the personal testimony of the Lutz family. They do not erase it. They sit beside it. Two explanations, two frameworks, the same timeline. During those 28 days, the Lutz children reportedly became quieter. Teachers and acquaintances later stated in interviews that the children seemed tired, withdrawn, not frightened necessarily, just changed. That observation, repeated across different sources, was one of the details that stayed consistent. Change without noise. In 1977, the story of the Lutz family's time in the house was adapted into a book. That book later inspired films. Legal disputes followed. Questions were raised about authenticity, licensing, financial agreements, and the role of ghost investigators and publishers. Depositions exist. Statements were recorded under oath. Some individuals later described the events as exaggerated. Others held firm that the family had experienced something real, something difficult to explain, something they did not want to relive. The conflicting testimony became part of the public record. What did not change were the facts of November 1974. 6 people died. Their names remained the same, their ages remained the same, their cause of death remained the same. The argument existed only around what, if anything, lingered after. Through the 1980s and 1990s, additional owners lived at the property. Several later stated publicly that they did not experience anything unusual. Some reported nuisance tourism, people trespassing, knocking on doors, taking photos late at night. That, they said, was the only disturbance. The most consistent real-world consequence of the story seemed to be intrusion. Strangers visiting a family home because they wanted to stand near a narrative. But the quiet detail, the one that echoes the deepest, remained the description of subtle nighttime sound. Not a haunting, not a spectacle. Just whispering. People familiar with the case sometimes mention a psychological dimension. Nighttime amplifies silence. Houses shift with temperature changes. Wood expands and contracts. Plumbing carries faint vibration. The brain, already conditioned by fear, grief, or expectation, assigns meaning to sound. That possibility exists. It belongs to the spectrum of explanation. Still, the Lutz family never recanted their core narrative. They repeated the same phrases for decades: cold, quiet, wakefulness at 3:15 a.m., and whispers beneath the sound of air. In criminal case literature, it is uncommon for a homicide site to be revisited as a place people analyze for other forms of disturbance. Most crime scenes return to ordinary life. People move in, people move out. Over time, the address becomes just an address again. That didn't happen here. The Amityville case created a layered narrative: tragedy first, then testimony, then scrutiny, then myth. Peel back the layers, and the core is still a family whose lives ended in a single night. The house itself is a structure of lumber, nails, and glass. The story attached to it is something else. Even skeptics, people who dismiss every paranormal claim outright, often acknowledge one element as undeniable: the psychological weight of living in a place where something terrible happened can affect the people who enter it. The architecture doesn't change. The address doesn't change. But meaning changes, and meaning lingers. When journalists revisited the Lutz case in later decades, they often asked the same question in interviews: what was it like at night? The answer rarely changed: quiet, still, and heavier after midnight. There were never reports of the house screaming into the darkness. There were never descriptions of overwhelming chaos. Even the most dramatic later interpretations remained rooted in the original thread, a thread defined by subtlety, a house that did not disturb the day, a house that waited for silence, a house that, according to the people who once slept inside it, whispered only after midnight. And that's when the unease deepened. When people revisit the Amityville case today, many focus on the films, the headlines, the arguments over truth versus fabrication. But beneath all of that sits a quieter chain of events, one that unfolds slowly, step by step, across 1974, 1975, and 1976. The dates remain fixed, the names remain unchanged, and through those fixed points, a story travels softly. In the official court transcripts, forensic investigators testified that every member of the DeFeo family had been shot while lying face down. The rifle was fired multiple times, a .35 caliber Marlin. No gun suppressor was ever recovered. Autopsy records stated that Louise, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew had likely been asleep when they were killed. Toxicology reports did not indicate sedatives, yet no one in surrounding houses reported alarm at the sound. There were scattered mentions of distant noise, but nothing that prompted a 911 call. That gap between expectation and recorded reaction remains one of the most cited details in the case. After the arrests, trials, and sentencing, after the cameras left, the home became a property listed for sale. A family bought it. The purchase price, $80,000, reflected both market value and the burden of history. The Lutz family took possession of the house on December 18, 1975. Within their first week inside, they said the tone of the house changed once the clock passed midnight. The Lutz family's testimony includes consistent descriptions of small disturbances, faint sounds, subtle temperature fluctuations, something like breath moving through an unseen space. None of these details appear in police reports from that time, because the family did not file formal complaints while they lived there. Their accounts emerged afterward in conversations, interviews, and legal testimony. One detail they repeated was the timing. The house did not feel different at 10 a.m. It did not feel different at 6 p.m. It was the hours between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. that seemed unusually still. George Lutz later described lying awake, listening to the space around him as if it were a living thing. His words, preserved in interviews across multiple years, rarely rise in volume or drama. They remain soft, level. He talks about listening, not witnessing, about waiting, not reacting. He said the whispers were never loud enough to identify, never clear enough to write down. Just the sense of something shared quietly nearby. That ambiguity is what people return to, because clearly defined danger forces decision. Ambiguity forces endurance. On December 24th, 1975, Christmas Eve, the house looked ordinary from the outside. Lights glowed inside, decorations were visible, cars passed by. The family stayed home. Later statements suggest that the children went to bed early. The adults remained awake slightly longer. And as the night passed, George again woke around 3:15 a.m. He said it was never jarring. He did not bolt upright. He simply opened his eyes and existed in the darkness, aware of the clock, aware of the quiet, aware of a subtle shift in air pressure around him. The 3:15 a.m. time point became one of the most referenced details in later retellings. Why that time? There is no verified forensic link between that exact minute and the murders, but repetition creates pattern, pattern creates memory, memory creates story. Meanwhile, the Suffolk County criminal record remained static. Ronald DeFeo Jr. served his sentence. His later statements fluctuated. At times, he described hearing voices leading up to the murders. At other times, he described drug use, anger, resentment. Psychiatric evaluations explored the possibility of mental illness. Attorneys debated legal responsibility versus diminished capacity. Judges ruled. Appeals were denied. The legal system moved predictably. The narrative outside of it did not. By the first week of January 1976, the Lutz family described their behavior as increasingly muted. Television was often left off. Music wasn't played loudly. The house grew quieter as the family grew quieter. Friends noticed, neighbors noticed. People accustomed to casual conversation began to observe longer pauses when speaking to them. Fear does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it causes people to shrink their world. In later years, skeptics, including journalists and investigators, pointed to financial stress as a potential influence. Mortgage payments, legal disputes, the prospect of a book deal, media attention, all of these elements became part of the larger conversation. And they should be, because when looking at a case that has both a verified criminal history and a subjective experiential narrative layered on top of it, every factor matters. But there remains a difference between incentive and experience, between interpretation and memory. Even individuals who doubted the paranormal aspects of the Lutz account sometimes acknowledged a more grounded psychological truth. Living in the site of a multiple homicide carries emotional gravity. People visit memorial sites. They lower their voices. They walk slowly. They observe without quite knowing why their instincts adjust. That reaction is not always superstition. Sometimes it is simply human awareness of loss. Inside 112 Ocean Avenue, loss had soaked into the foundation. The Lutz family, knowingly or unknowingly, stepped into that space. And the timing mattered. Nighttime strips away distraction. Silence exposes thought. And when the house itself seemed to exhale soft sound after midnight, the effect intensified. In one recorded interview, Kathleen Lutz said she felt the atmosphere shift most clearly when the rest of the world was asleep. She described lying still, listening for clarity, yet hearing only distance, a murmur without a source. She did not describe shouting. She did not describe chaos, just sound at the edge of perception. It is worth noting that subauditory perception, the sense of hearing something without identifiable content, is a phenomenon studied in psychology and neuroscience. The mind can interpret environmental noise, vibration, or airflow as meaningful speech. Combine that with stress, grief, fear, and expectation, and the effect can intensify. Science offers one framework, personal testimony offers another. Both sit inside the same timeline. On January 12, 1976, just 2 days before the family left the home permanently, George reportedly woke once more at 3:15 a.m. He walked the halls. He paused at doorways. He listened to the hum of the house. He said the air felt heavier than usual. He said the silence felt shaped, not loud, not threatening, just aware. 2 days later, January 14, 1976, the Lutz family left the house in what they later described as fear and exhaustion. They did not return to sleep there again. Their belongings remained inside for a period while arrangements were made to remove them. That departure date is not speculation. It appears in records, it appears in interviews, it appears in financial documentation. What remains less defined is what, specifically, pushed them to leave that day instead of the week before or the week after. Perhaps it was accumulation. Perhaps it was psychological strain. Perhaps it was the compounded effect of late-night whispers layered onto an already fragile sense of safety. Whatever the reason, the result was fixed. They were inside the house for 28 days. Then, they were not. Later, owners lived there without public reports of disturbance. The address was eventually changed, a practical step, partly to deter unwanted visitors. The physical structure endured. Paint changed, landscaping changed. The river behind the property remained. Life went on. But the story stayed. Because once a whisper is introduced into a narrative, Once midnight becomes a reference point, it rarely disappears. It simply grows quieter, echoing across retellings, resurfacing when someone lowers their voice and begins with the same simple sentence. This is a true story. The people who believe the Lutz family hear sincerity in their restraint. The people who doubt them hear opportunity, pressure, suggestibility, or misinterpretation. And both perspectives continue to coexist in the literature surrounding the case. But beneath the arguments, beneath the myth-making and commercialization, something steady remains anchored. A real family died in November 1974. Another real family occupied the house from December 1975 to January 1976. And almost every careful retelling of their experience returns to one soft, repeating detail. The house did not disturb the day. It only whispered, "After midnight." What happened next changed everything. After the Lutz family left on January 14, 1976, the story did not end. It simply shifted from lived experience to documented investigation, interviews, and analysis. Their departure marked the final day of their 28-day residency inside 112 Ocean Avenue. That number did not change. The date did not change. Those details appear repeatedly in legal filings, media reports, and later books. In the days that followed, the house sat mostly empty. Furniture remained. Personal belongings remained. The structure itself, the walls, the staircase, the bedrooms, remained. But the family who had once listened to the house at 3:15 a.m. was gone. What came next belonged largely to journalists, investigators, and skeptics. One of the more commonly referenced events took place in February 1976, when a team that included Ed and Lorraine Warren entered the home. This visit has been covered in multiple documentaries and articles over the decades. Photographs from that night, including the well-known image purported to show a childlike figure at the top of the staircase, have circulated widely. The authenticity and interpretation of that photograph have been debated extensively, but its date and the fact that it was taken during a documented investigation are traceable. That investigation represented the beginning of a long public dissection of the case. Around the same time, members of the media interviewed the Lutz family in controlled environments. Their voices, recorded in calm, measured tones, repeated the same sequence of events. They did not describe dramatic confrontations. They did not claim to have battled an unseen force. They talked about sound, atmosphere, waking at the same time night after night, a sense of presence that did not belong to the daylight hours. They also emphasized something important. During the day, life felt almost manageable. It was the nights that changed everything. Criminal psychologists who later reviewed the case spoke about environmental stress amplification, the idea that when individuals live in a location associated with violence, even ordinary sensory experiences can take on a heightened meaning. Shadows feel darker, silence feels heavier, noise feels intentional. That concept does not invalidate testimony. It simply offers one possible frame. Meanwhile, Suffolk County records continued to document the legal life of Ronald DeFeo Jr. He remained incarcerated. His appeals moved through the system. Journalists periodically revisited the transcripts, the autopsy reports, the ballistic evidence. Those components of the case never drifted into ambiguity. They stayed rooted in paper, signatures, and sworn testimony. The experiential layer, the part involving whispers, continued to live in interviews and recollections. In the late 1970s, civil litigation emerged concerning rights, profits, and claims connected to books and film adaptations of the Lutz story. Depositions were taken. Attorneys questioned motivations, financial arrangements, and accuracy. Some individuals involved in the broader ecosystem of the story later expressed doubt about aspects of the narrative. Others defended it. Those contradictions became part of the dataset. But throughout those proceedings, one simple statement was repeated again and again. The original murders were real. 6 people died. Nothing in the later disputes changed that. Former neighbors of 112 Ocean Avenue often described the sudden influx of curiosity seekers as the most disruptive element that followed the story's publication. Cars lined the narrow residential street. Some people knocked on doors. Others idled quietly, hoping to feel something undefined. Local police occasionally had to redirect traffic. The house, built as a family home, became a landmark against its will. This type of attention is not uncommon in high-profile criminal cases. Locations become symbolic. People project meaning onto architecture. They return to the same address because it provides a physical anchor for an otherwise abstract narrative. The side effect is that ordinary families, attempting to live ordinary lives, often inherit the burden. Later owners stated publicly that they did not encounter anything resembling the Lutz account. They did not report whispers. They did not report waking at 3:15 a.m. They reported disruption from visitors, not from the building. Those statements are also part of the public record. That duality, testimony that something happened, followed by testimony that nothing happened, created a kind of narrative tension that has persisted for decades. It invites two different questions. What did the Lutz family experience? And what does it mean to live in the shadow of tragedy? Both questions matter. In the 1990s and 2000s, authors and documentarians revisited the case with new interviews, archival materials, and sometimes a more skeptical tone. They reviewed earlier claims, they compared statements across time, they identified inconsistencies and also highlighted the details that never changed. The dates, the addresses, the names, the clock at 3:15 a.m. In many accounts, the Lutz family described the whispers as sound without language, not a clear sentence, not even a recognizable voice, just the impression of something present, breathed into the quiet of the house after midnight. The fact that this detail remained understated, never exaggerated into spectacle, is one reason it continues to unsettle listeners. Because subtlety is often more difficult to challenge. Clinical researchers studying sleep have noted that nocturnal awakenings tend to occur during specific physiological cycles. Stress, cold temperatures, or altered sleep patterns can cause people to wake around consistent times. When meaning attaches to those times, the waking becomes part of the story, not just a biological event. Again, this does not negate experience. It simply widens the field of possible interpretation. By the time Ronald DeFeo Jr. died in March 2021, the Amityville case had already existed in the public consciousness for nearly 5 decades. His death was documented in state records. Obituaries noted his conviction and the notoriety of the case. Journalists revisited the timeline. The names of the victims were spoken again. The address resurfaced. The discussions followed familiar paths. Yet the quieter thread, the one involving whispers after midnight, continued to surface in documentaries, podcasts, and long-form articles. Not as proof of anything supernatural, but as part of the narrative history of the location. Because stories, even when challenged, leave residue. When people who study trauma talk about place memory, they describe how environments can accumulate emotional significance. A room where a difficult conversation once happened can feel different years later. A home associated with loss can change the way people move through it. Weight without sound. For the Lutz family, the weight seemed to carry sound, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to notice. The whisper motif, whether psychological, environmental, or something else, became the axis around which every later retelling revolved. Midnight, stillness, a sound just at the edge of hearing. And always the reminder that beneath that layer sits a documented crime, one that ended 6 real lives on November 13th, 1974. That truth remains immovable. Everything else exists beside it. People still debate whether the Lutz family experienced something unexplainable, something psychological, or some combination of both. They also debate the degree to which financial pressure, media influence, or suggestion shape the story. Each viewpoint brings evidence. Each viewpoint has gaps. And the result is a narrative that never fully settles. But one element has remained remarkably consistent across decades, regardless of belief. The house did not shout. It waited for silence. It waited for midnight. And then, according to those who once lived there, it whispered. But that still wasn't the strangest part. By the time the Amityville story entered its second and third decades in the public eye, it had already become something larger than the people who had lived through it. But underneath the documentaries, the interviews, the reenactments, and the debate, the same unchanging set of anchors remained. November 13, 1974. 6 deaths. A conviction. December 18th, 1975 to January 14th, 1976. 28 days. A house that only seemed to whisper after midnight. As researchers, journalists, and skeptics revisited the case through the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, many returned to the forensic record. They examined ballistic evidence, autopsy reports, police statements, and court documents. Those elements were stable. They did not fluctuate with retellings, the names, ages, and positions of the DeFeo family members in their beds. Those details were frozen in time. Other elements, the reported experiences of the Lutz family, belong to a different category. Memory. Memory is real, but memory is also fluid. And so, the conversation widened. Some investigators emphasized how sensory deprivation and stress can affect perception. When a person lies awake in a silent house long after midnight, the brain can magnify small environmental sounds, air moving through vents, wood expanding with temperature shifts, plumbing pressure equalizing. None of those explanations erase the Lutz account. They coexist with it as parallel interpretations. Others focused on the symbolic weight of location. A house does not think. A house does not feel. But the people inside it do. And when a structure becomes associated with homicide, especially one that was widely covered in the press, that knowledge can settle over daily life like a film. Every hallway feels longer. Every room feels stiller. Every sound feels intentional. And always, the reports say, the house whispered after midnight. There were never reliable accounts of midday disturbance. There were no consistent stories of chaos at dinner time or loud disruption in the afternoon. Instead, the sensation seemed to align with silence. Silence outside, silence inside. Then the faintest sense of presence beneath it. In archived interviews, George Lutz never raised his voice. His tone remained level, measured, almost clinical at times. He spoke about 3:15 a.m. the way someone might talk about the weather. Not theatrical, not embellished, just consistent. He would lie awake. He would feel the house around him. And for reasons he could never fully explain, he would listen. Researchers studying hypervigilance, a psychological state often associated with prolonged stress, have noted that the brain in such a state constantly scans for threat. Even when nothing is wrong, even when the environment is objectively quiet, the body waits, the mind waits, and subtle sound becomes meaningful. That framework has been applied to the Amityville account more than once. At the same time, people who believe in the paranormal hear something different in those same testimonies. They hear sincerity. They hear repetition. They hear a family describing an experience they did not seek, an experience they later tried to leave behind. Two interpretations. One timeline. No definitive answer. Through the late 20th century, the house itself continued to be bought and sold. Records of those transactions exist in county archives. New residents installed new furniture. Children grew up. Lawns were mowed. Lights turned on and off. A structure designed to be ordinary continued to function as one. But outside the property line, the story did not fade. Authors revisited it. Filmmakers revisited it. Podcast hosts revisited it. Skeptics revisited it. Believers revisited it. And every version, whether supportive or critical, eventually returned to the same refrain. Midnight. 3:15 a.m. Whispers. Even those who rejected supernatural explanations outright acknowledged the power of pattern. When something repeats often enough, it shapes expectation, and expectation shapes memory. Still, there was something else people commented on. The tone. The Lutz family did not recount their experiences as grand spectacle. They did not describe shouting entities, violent forces, or overwhelming terror. They described something quieter, something almost polite in its restraint, something that made no effort to announce itself during the day, which is, in some ways, more unsettling. Because if something arrives loudly, it can be confronted. If something arrives silently, you live with it. There is also another documented truth running beneath this narrative. Crime scenes cast long shadows. Families rarely continue in those homes unchanged. Even when nothing inexplicable occurs, the knowledge alone can alter behavior, sleep patterns, eating habits, social interaction, and emotional stability. In that respect, The Lutz account intersects with broader research on how environmental trauma affects human psychology. And that research is real. So is the grief associated with the loss of the DeFeo family. A grief that extended outward through relatives, friends, neighbors, police officers, medical examiners, juries, and communities. The murders were not a story. They were a crime. A crime with paperwork. A crime with funerals. A crime with irreversible impact. Everything that came afterward, the whispers, the nighttime awakenings, the sense of presence, existed atop that foundation, and it is impossible to separate the two. In later years, some members of the Lutz family reflected on how the attention changed their lives. They spoke about public scrutiny, mistrust, questions, and pressure. They were not always treated as people. Sometimes they were treated as symbols, symbols for belief, symbols for skepticism, symbols for whatever narrative someone else wanted to support. Meanwhile, the house remained a house. Paint fades, numbers change, owners come and go. But the address lingers in cultural memory. When journalists revisit Amityville today, nearly half a century after the original murders, they often describe how ordinary the street looks, how quiet it feels at night, how the air settles into the same stillness that exists in thousands of other towns across the United States. And that ordinariness might be the most unsettling part of all, because tragedy rarely announces itself beforehand, and memory rarely leaves afterward. The whispered element remains a small thing in the context of everything that happened, a detail on the edge of the narrative. Not the loudest part, not the most important part, just the most persistent. A family once said that when the world around them went silent, the house added sound back into the darkness, soft, indistinct, almost apologetic. And then, just as suddenly, it would fade again, leaving only the clock and the knowledge of what had happened inside those walls the year before. The murders were a matter of law. The whispers were a matter of testimony. Both continue to exist, side by side, without ever fully resolving into a single truth. And as with many stories tied to real-world violence, the longer people look at Amityville, the quieter the questions become. No more shouting debates, no more loud declarations, just softer voices asking the same, simple thing. What was it really like in that house after midnight? And the answer, repeated across decades of retellings, rarely changes. Quiet, still, and deeper somehow. After dark. But that still wasn't the strangest part. As the Amityville story moved further from the events of 1974 and 1976, something interesting began to happen. The louder debates, the arguments on television, the courtroom statements, the dramatic retellings, slowly gave way to quieter reflections. Journalists who once approached the case with urgency began approaching it with distance. Researchers revisited the original files. And ordinary people who had grown up hearing fragments of the story started asking a softer question. How much of it was the house? And how much of it was the people inside it? That question matters, because the facts remained unchanged. 6 members of the DeFeo family were killed on November 13, 1974. Their son, Ronald DeFeo Jr., was arrested, convicted, and sentenced. The Lutz family moved into the same home on December 18, 1975. They left on January 14, 1976, after 28 days. Those dates are not speculation. They exist in official records. What does not exist in official records is the whisper that lived and continues to live in testimony. In the early 2000s, renewed media coverage surfaced when new documentaries revisited the case. Some included previously unheard interview segments. Others re-examined transcriptions of conversations with the Lutz family. The tone of most of these projects was slower, calmer, more analytical than sensational. And in that quieter analysis, something became clear. No matter how much the external narrative changed, the internal descriptions of nighttime whispering rarely did. That consistency is unsettling in its simplicity. Not voices shouting, not commands, not threats. Just faint sound that seemed to exist only between midnight and dawn. Even skeptics often pause at that point, because the pattern itself is strange. Patterns suggest systems. Systems suggest rules. And rules, even unexplained ones, create structure. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3:15 a.m. Wakefulness, silence, then something else. In clinical literature, prolonged stress can condition the body to wake at predictable intervals. Over time, the brain begins to anticipate the awakening. The clock becomes a symbol, the symbol gains weight, awareness gathers around it, and eventually the experience becomes self-sustaining. But there is another layer to consider: context. This was not an ordinary home. It was the site of an act of extreme violence. Everyone who walked through the door knew that, and context informs perception. When people stand at the edge of a cliff, their breathing changes. When people walk into a hospital, their voices lower. When people stand inside a courtroom, they become aware of themselves. A house can do that too, not because it is alive, but because the memory attached to it is. Still, the Lutz family did not describe fear the way fear is usually told. They described exhaustion, a wearing down, a gradual loss of emotional resilience, the sense that something in the house was constant. Soft sound, late at night, never during the day. And then, on the 28th day, they left. People sometimes forget that leaving was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of years of scrutiny, interviews, litigation, and financial pressure. Their lives changed in ways that did not resemble a horror film. They became figures discussed by strangers. Their credibility was examined, their motives questioned, their privacy narrowed. Believers saw them as witnesses. Skeptics saw them as participants in a narrative industry. But rarely were they simply seen as people again. And maybe that too is part of the quiet unease surrounding Amityville, because real tragedy fractures outward and continues affecting people long after the event itself. The DeFeo family never returned home. The Lutz family never truly escaped the story, and the neighborhood never fully regained anonymity. Meanwhile, the house, stripped of its original address number, repainted, remodeled, remained standing. New families moved in, children played in the yard, neighbors walked dogs past the property without looking twice. With time, the physical structure blended back into the rhythm of ordinary life, but the story stayed, and almost every retelling carried the same whisper. One documentary producer once said that what disturbed him most was not the paranormal claims. It was the restraint of the testimony, the way the Lutz family spoke about the house, not with theatrical urgency, but with careful, measured language, as if they were still trying to understand what they had lived through. There is another truth here, one that scholars of criminal psychology often note. Exposure to violent history changes people. Police officers who work homicide develop coping mechanisms. Journalists who cover traumatic events learn emotional distance. Jurors in serious criminal trials sometimes experience lingering anxiety. So, what happens when a family moves into the setting itself? That question is rarely addressed directly, but it exists beneath the discussion, a quiet thread connecting everything that followed. For many who revisit the case today, the haunting is not the point. The haunting, if it existed, is secondary to something more concrete. How do humans respond to tragedy that occurred in the place they now call home? And perhaps the whisper, whether literal or psychological, was the mind's way of acknowledging weight, not loud enough to overwhelm, not clear enough to define, just present, always after midnight, never when the sun was out. There is a striking reality in that detail. It suggests that daylight brings protection, not from the environment, but from our own thoughts. Daily activity gives structure, it gives purpose, it gives distraction. But when the world quiets, the mind fills the silence. And maybe the house didn't whisper at all. Maybe silence did. Still, the phrase persists. The house whispered after midnight. It persists because it feels true, not as fact, but as metaphor. A metaphor for lingering grief, for memory, for the subtle ways trauma continues speaking long after the event has ended. And yet, even with all possible psychological, financial, environmental, and cultural explanations laid out neatly on the table, one detail remains unresolved. Those who lived there said the experience felt external, not imagined, not internal, external. And human beings are often the most unsettled when something cannot be categorized cleanly. So the story endures, not as proof of the paranormal, and not as a cautionary tale about fabrication, but as a quiet intersection of crime, memory, and place. A real house, a real family, a real tragedy, and one soft claim that still drifts through late-night discussions, that after the clocks crossed midnight, when the world outside stilled, the house did not sleep. It whispered. And that's when the unease settled deepest. As the Amityville story reached its fourth and fifth decades in public conversation, something else began to change. The house itself, the physical structure at what was once known as 112 Ocean Avenue, quietly receded from the spotlight. It was still there, still standing, still part of an ordinary residential street in Suffolk County, New York. But the narrative surrounding it began to live more in archives, articles, legal documents, and late-night discussions than on the lawn outside. And yet, the core sequence of events never shifted. November 13th, 1974. 6 family members dead. A conviction. December 18th, 1975 to January 14th, 1976. 28 days inside the house. Reports of whispers after midnight. Those dates did not bend to interpretation. They did not adjust themselves to opinion. They remained anchored in paper and ink. But the whisper lived elsewhere, in interviews, in memory, in the quiet space between what can be proven and what can only be said. When journalists returned to Amityville for retrospective reporting in the 2010s, many of them focused more closely on the human cost of attention. Former neighbors described years of strangers driving slowly down the street. Some had their children woken late at night by idling cars. Others put up fences or cameras. Residents had to explain to delivery drivers that they did not live in a museum. They lived in a neighborhood. The address was eventually changed, not erased, not disguised beyond recognition, but altered, in part to dull the magnet that kept drawing people to the same front yard. Property records reflect those changes. Ownership transfers are documented. Mortgage filings exist. The house moved forward through time the same way every house does, steadily, quietly, without theatrics. But the story kept circling back. In long-form articles, reporters often chose to revisit the original Suffolk County case files, police statements, medical examiner documentation, photographs, testimony. Those materials still contain the clearest timeline available. They did not mention whispers. They did not mention midnight awakenings. They focused on ballistic angles, entry wounds, blood spatter, and the order in which the victims were found. The crime existed firmly in the realm of physical evidence. Everything layered on afterward existed in memory and discourse. Criminal psychologists studying the case, sometimes decades later, acknowledged a difficult truth. Places associated with multi-victim homicides rarely remain emotionally neutral. People assign narrative to them, meaning, weight, fear, curiosity, sometimes reverence, sometimes spectacle. And that assignment does not require anything supernatural. It only requires being human. The Lutz family entered such a place knowingly. They did not stumble into the history. They were aware of it when they purchased the home. That decision, and the consequences of it, has been discussed extensively in books, depositions, interviews, and commentary. Some saw the purchase as a financial opportunity. Others saw it as a miscalculation. Still others saw it simply as a family trying to build a life inside a house they believed they could emotionally manage. But inside those walls, late at night, something happened that they later could not easily dismiss. The 3:15 a.m. waking remained one of the most consistently reported details across decades of interviews. Even when interpretations differed, that clock time appeared again and again. Not always with drama, often just stated as fact. I would wake up. It would be 3:15. Nothing more. No raised voice, no insistence, just a repeated statement. Some medical professionals pointed to circadian rhythm patterns and REM cycle disturbances as possible explanations. Others mentioned stress, hyper-awareness, sleep conditioning. And it is true, the body remembers routine. When someone wakes at the same time repeatedly, the pattern can reinforce itself. Eventually, anticipation does the work. But for the Lutz family, it didn't feel like anticipation. It felt like interruption. They described the house as quieter at night than any place they had lived before, quiet enough that even the smallest sounds became noticeable. the refrigerator hum, the air shifting inside vents, wood contracting in winter temperatures. These environmental details, common in most homes, gain significance because they occurred inside a place saturated with meaning. Meaning changes perception, and perception shapes memory. But the phrase that continued to unsettle listeners was the same. The house whispered after midnight. Real-world whispering has a physical source. Someone's breath, someone's throat, someone's lips near the ear. In the Lutz account, there was none. Just sound without origin, not clear enough to quote, not sharp enough to scare, just present. A psychologist once described the experience as acoustic pareidolia, the brain attempting to create pattern from ambiguous sound. Another described it as environmental grief response. These frameworks are not sensational. They are not mystical. They are measured attempts to understand why a family described the same detail again and again, for decades. But the Lutzes never claimed certainty about cause. They only claimed certainty about experience. And that difference matters, because stories become distorted when people insist on explanation. They become clearer when people insist only on what they perceived, which is what the Lutz family did. They did not describe chaos during the day. They did not describe constant fear. They described ordinary life, punctured by nighttime disturbance. And then, overwhelmed, they left. The 28 days remained one of the firmest anchors in the entire narrative. Not 27, not 29, 28. That number is referenced in legal documents. It is referenced in sworn statements. It is referenced in the financial and contractual trail that followed. 1 month minus 3 days. That was the amount of time they believed they could endure inside the house. Afterward, the story became something else. It became books. It became films. It became debate. It became a subject in college classrooms. It became a case study in mass media amplification. And in that amplification, the details sometimes stretched, sometimes contracted, sometimes were misremembered or misquoted. But beneath the shifting versions, the core remained. A real crime occurred. A real family later lived in that crime scene. They described whispers after midnight. They left. Everything else, belief, doubt, interpretation, skepticism, faith, orbits those simple truths. There is a concept in trauma studies known as residual narrative. It describes the story that remains after the event has ended. The way the mind keeps returning to specific images, sounds, or details long after they have stopped occurring. Sometimes the detail is small, a gesture, a phrase, a moment. In the Amityville case, the residual narrative is a whisper, not a scream, not an apparition, not violence repeated, just sound at the edge of hearing, late at night, when the world outside is still. It is an unusual choice for a story that became world famous, because the world tends to remember spectacle. But what endured here was restraint. And when restraint endures longer than spectacle, it often means something deeper is being processed beneath the surface. The whisper remains. So does the silence surrounding it. And the deeper people look into the case, through archived police files, court records, forensic analyses, interviews, psychological commentary, the more the same question continues to surface. What exactly was happening in that house, between midnight and dawn? And that still wasn't the strangest part. With distance, the kind measured not in miles, but in years, the Amityville story began to look less like a single event and more like a series of overlapping circles. In the very center sat the murders of November 13th, 1974, fixed, documented, sealed into official record. Around that, the 28 days the Lutz family spent inside the house from December 18th, 1975 to January 14th, 1976, recorded in interviews, contracts, legal filings. And surrounding those two circles, the wider space of interpretation, speculation, belief, disbelief, and the lingering whisper of something that, according to testimony, only existed after midnight. By the 2010s and 2020s, almost everyone directly connected to the case had already lived entire lifetimes beyond those dates. Some had died, others had withdrawn from public comment. A few occasionally spoke in interviews, their voices older, slower, more reflective, and when they did, the tone was rarely dramatic. It was careful, considered, weighted by time. The details that were always true remain true. 6 members of the DeFeo family were killed. Their son was convicted. The Lutz family moved into the house 1 year later. They left after 28 days. Those points form the spine of the story. They do not bend, but around them, people continue to ask the same question. Was the whisper something external, or something internal made audible by silence? In quiet conversations, the kind that happen long after the cameras go away, even skeptics sometimes admit that the most disquieting part of the Lutz account is not what was claimed, but what was not claimed. There were no elaborate scripts, no extravagant sensory detail, no precise dialogues with the unseen, just a repeated, almost reluctant admission that something felt present after midnight, something barely there, something that brushed the edge of perception. And then there was 3:15 a.m. That time, mentioned so many times across years and sources, became almost a symbol, not of the murders themselves, but of the moment when night turns heavy, when a house feels largest, when the world outside is most still. Doctors and sleep researchers have pointed out that this period often coincides with deeper stages of sleep cycling, hormonal dips, body temperature changes. People under stress may wake then. People grieving may wake then. People frightened may wake then. So the explanation may be physiological, or it may be psychological. But the experience, reported consistently, remains. A thing can be both explainable and deeply unsettling. The Warrens' 1976 investigation, whether one accepts their conclusions or not, became another node in the timeline. Their presence in the house is documented, their statements are recorded. Some people trust those statements, others do not. But the fact that they were there, a few weeks after the Lutz family left, is not in dispute. The photograph said to show a small figure peering from the upstairs landing has been analyzed repeatedly. Lighting arguments, exposure arguments, reflection arguments. Some say it is clearly explained, others say it is not. But in the quietest discussions, people often admit that the photograph itself is not what lingers. It is the pattern that lingers. Quiet house, midnight hours, soft sound. In criminal psychology, there is a concept known as secondary trauma imprinting. It describes how places associated with violence can acquire emotional presence for those who later occupy them, even when they had no connection to the original event. The mind projects. The body registers. The environment becomes a mirror for unspoken anxiety. Researchers who apply that lens to the Amityville case often frame the whisper as an echo of awareness rather than an external voice. But the people who lived inside the house did not experience it that way. They experienced it as other. And that distinction, between whether something is believed to come from inside or outside oneself, is one of the deepest divides in human experience. For those who believe their perception originates internally, the explanation lies in the brain. For those who believe their perception originates externally, the explanation lies in the environment. And in Amityville, those interpretations have existed side by side for nearly 50 years. The house itself continues to exist. It has been renovated. Its famous windows change shape. The yard is tended. Its address altered. Families live there. They wake, they make coffee, they go to work, they return, they sleep. For them, it is a home, not a symbol. And in a way, that is the quiet closing of most crime scenes. Life resumes. Yet the story remains, not because of spectacle, but because of stillness, because the whisper, if it existed, did not interrupt. It insinuated. And insinuation is one of the most persistent forms of memory. Even now, when documentaries revisit Amityville, the pacing is slow, the narration is careful, the tone is subdued. Directors and producers seem to recognize, consciously or not, that whatever haunted the imagination about that place was never loud. It was the suggestion that sometimes silence is not empty. For people who reject every supernatural claim outright, the case still has value as a study in how tragedy reshapes perception, how environments can feel different when the past inside them is heavy, how the line between fear and experience can blur when the world outside goes still, and for those who believe there was something more in that house. The whisper is not frightening because it was powerful. It is frightening because it was gentle, because it waited, because it never insisted, because it arrived when no one else was speaking. And because, once heard, it was impossible to unhear. The residual narrative of Amityville does not revolve around ghosts or possession for many people who discuss it today. It revolves around a simple, unsettling thought. If a place remembers, how does it speak? Through architecture, through silence, through the people who pass through it. The Lutz family left after 28 days. That act, decisive and final, speaks to something undeniable. Whatever they experienced, it changed the course of their lives, not for a week, not for a month, for decades. Financially, emotionally, socially, they became part of a story that never fully let them leave. The DeFeo family, whose lives ended on that November night, also remain at the center, not as mystery, but as tragedy. Every careful retelling returns to their names, their ages. The reality that 6 individuals went to sleep in a house and never woke up. The whisper, if it existed at all, came later. And even now, with archives full of interviews, films, documentaries, opinion pieces, legal filings, psychological essays, and retrospective coverage, the question remains unresolved. Maybe it always will be. Because some stories do not conclude, they just grow quieter over time. Like a house at 3:15 a.m., the clock glows, the walls settle, the air shifts. And in that thin space between waking and sleep, between memory and imagination, between fear and fact, something almost, but not quite, forms into sound. The story of Amityville lives there now, not in shouting, not in spectacle, but in the lingering sense that late at night, when the world has gone still, the past sometimes leans forward. Not to frighten, just to whisper. And that still wasn't the strangest part. As the Amityville story settled into permanence, no longer a current event, no longer a developing case, but a historical narrative, a kind of stillness formed around it. The facts remained rooted where they had always been. November 13th, 1974. The murders. December 18th, 1975. The Lutz family moved in. January 14th, 1976, they left. 28 days, whispers after midnight. And across decades of documentaries, legal transcripts, archived interviews, and retrospective reporting, the tone continued to shift away from urgency toward contemplation. Because time has a way of cooling the surface of even the most heated stories. When criminologists discuss Amityville now, they often begin with the impact of violent crime on communities. Police officers who responded to the original scene in 1974 carried those images with them long after they left the house. Detectives, forensic technicians, prosecutors, and defense attorneys all became part of a tragedy that expanded far beyond a single family. The legal system responded as it was designed to do. Evidence was collected, a suspect was prosecuted, a sentence was imposed. Appeals wound through the courts for years. Those processes were slow, methodical, procedural. The whispers existed outside of that system. They were not weighed as evidence. They were not presented to a jury. They were not referenced in appellate briefs. They remained where they began, inside the realm of lived experience, spoken in measured tones by the family who once listened for them in the dark. And yet, the story of those whispers continues to draw attention because it sits at the intersection of crime, memory, and place, 3 elements that rarely separate cleanly. A murder is not confined to the instant it occurs. It reshapes the space around it. It alters the meaning of the place where it happened. It marks the lives of those who were there, and sometimes the lives of those who come after. The Lutz family stepped into that altered meaning. They did not cause it. They did not define it. They encountered it. And the way they processed that encounter, quietly, slowly, with language that rarely rose above a whisper itself, became part of the cultural record. Even now, when their interviews are replayed, what stands out most is the restraint. Calm recounting. Soft description. An unwillingness to embellish what they say they experienced. It is not proof. It is not dismissal. It is testimony, and testimony is the fragile space between what can be verified and what can only be described. There is another layer to the Amityville narrative, one often mentioned in journals and academic discussion that speaks to collective memory. Over time, a story can leave the hands of those who lived it and become something society carries instead. It evolves, it adapts, it reflects the fears and fascinations of each new generation that encounters it. But even as interpretation moves, the anchors remain. The crime happened, the names of the victims remain, the house stood, another family moved in, they left. And beneath all of that runs the quietest thread, not the most important, but perhaps the most haunting. The idea that the house seemed to speak only when the world went still. Not during storms, not during arguments, not during the day. Only when everything else was silent. Only after midnight. For those who find natural explanation sufficient, the whisper becomes a symbol of stress, expectation, and the human mind's need to make meaning from uncertainty. For those who hold other beliefs, the whisper becomes evidence of something that lingers, not loud and violent, but soft and patient. And for many people, the truth lies somewhere in between, because trauma is rarely simple, memory is rarely clean, history is rarely quiet. Even when the sound it leaves behind barely rises above silence. The Amityville case now exists in museums of thought rather than rooms of active investigation. It is studied, discussed, questioned, preserved, and the families, both the DeFios and the Lutzes, remain at the center of it. Real people, real lives, real consequences. No matter how many retellings are produced, every careful version returns to the same place. A suburban house on a quiet New York street. A night in 1974 that ended 6 lives, and a family 1 year later who said the house never raised its voice. It whispered, and what unsettled them most was not the volume, but the timing. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3:15 a.m., the hours when the world holds its breath. The story ends not with a revelation, not with certainty, but with an unresolved thought. Some houses keep their history quietly, and sometimes the quiet is what stays with us the longest. This is a true story. It isn't dramatic, but it changed everything for the people involved. Nearly 50 years have passed since the night the DeFeo family went to sleep inside their home and never woke up. Nearly 50 years since the Lutz family stepped into that same house and, within 28 days, stepped back out, leaving furniture, belongings, and a piece of themselves behind. Time has moved forward, the house has changed, addresses have shifted, paint has faded and been replaced. Children have grown up on that street without ever knowing the weight of the story beneath their footsteps. But the record remains. There was a crime, there was grief, there was testimony about midnight whispers, and the world listened, not because the house shouted for attention, not because the story demanded belief, but because somewhere, deep inside the space where fact and memory overlap, the idea of a place that only speaks when everything else is quiet feels familiar. We all have rooms we enter more softly. We all have memories that grow louder at night. We all understand on some level that silence is rarely empty. The Amityville case does not end with certainty. It ends with the same stillness that runs through every careful retelling. A soft awareness that after midnight, when clocks glow and the world goes still, the past sometimes feels closer than it should, not to terrify, not to harm, just to remind us it is still there. And in that way, the house on Ocean Avenue has become less a location, and more a reminder of how long memory can linger.